Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm gonna sneak a drink here. It's been an interesting couple of weeks. At the end of February, I got an email one night from Fergus. If you don't know who Fergus is, he practices here. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm Carol. I'm the resident priest here, at least for another 2 months. Anyway, Fergus sent me this email and asked if I would be willing to do a funeral or a memorial service for a young man who died, and he'd been in prison, and while he was in prison he got involved in Buddhism, and his family wanted him to have a Buddhist ceremony. I had no idea what all was coming. I of course said yes, and then he said, well, you need to contact Rabbi Stephen. I'm like, okay. And he said, I'm not sure how he's involved, but he's the one who's helping them find someone. I said, oh, okay, great. So I ended up talking to Rabbi Stephen, and meanwhile Fergus sent me a link to a news story. I'm like, okay, this is a little odd. Turned out the young man and his wife and his unborn child had been killed by someone in their family. And I was like, okay, well, this is not your usual memorial service, but hey, you know, if you wanted a Buddhist ceremony, that's what we will do. And I enjoyed talking to Rabbi Stephen. He was in a bit of a hurry because he has 500 families in his congregation. He said, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm so rushed. And I said, yeah, well, you are a little busier than I am. I thought, wow, I can't even imagine being responsible for 500 families. I was in awe. But he was also very, very kind, very compassionate toward the family and their loss, and gave me the number of the mother to call and make arrangements. And he said he would be happy to come and be part of the service if I wanted him. And I said, of course. You know, he said, so let me know when it is. And obviously Fridays and Saturdays don't work because that's Shabbat. So, you know, I said, no problem. I will figure something out with her that does not include those days. And then I called her. It's hard to imagine what that feels like to lose your child's spouse, and your unborn grandchild that you'll never get to meet. And if you think I'm a little emotional, yeah, she was too. And I certainly understand why, because it was even more of a loss to realize that your own family member was the person who caused this. And at the same time, all she wanted to do was to do something that her son would have wanted for himself. Even though she didn't understand anything of what we are, what we do, she didn't even know what particular sect of Buddhism he was involved in. And I said, well, that's okay. We can just focus on the things that are common to all of them in the ceremony. And in my own mind, I'm thinking, and how do you put together a memorial service or funeral for this? And what can you actually say that could possibly make any difference? But even just being on the phone, part of the answer was right there. You're on the phone. You're present. You don't back away from the tears, hers or yours. You can't fix it, clearly. And the only thing you can do is be there and set the wheels in motion and put together the best service you can for people who don't know anything about Buddhism and probably are Christian and think that we're all going to hell anyway, and try to make them understand that that's not what this is, that it's actually complementary, that Buddhism, because Buddha didn't claim to be a god, was a man. He was a teacher, a great teacher. And he was such a great teacher that his work is still important today. It has continually spread through the years since he died. And to try to explain to them that there are lots of Christians who are also Buddhist, because, there's actually, if you look at the beliefs of Buddhism and the beliefs of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, it doesn't contradict each other. They actually work together in many ways. The precepts and the Ten Commandments are not all that dissimilar. There are a few differences, and that's okay. But they're not differences that, in my view, cause any issues. But I remember even my mother coming up to me one time. My visual is, I remember I was going to the refrigerator to get something to drink, and she stepped in my way and said, "Why don't you believe in Jesus anymore?" I'm like, "Well, who said I don't?" And she said, "Well, you're going to be a priest." And I said, "Yeah, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe in God or believe in Jesus." I said, some Buddhists do and some don't, but it has nothing to do with Buddhism because it's not theistic. So I felt fairly comfortable that I could do that part, kind of make them feel comfortable that there wasn't going to be lightning coming through the roof, and they weren't going to hell for participating. But at the same time, a lot of what we use in service can be really off-putting to someone who hasn't practiced and who doesn't understand the context of some of the texts that we use. And that's not a bad thing. Those are things that are meaningful to us, and they're appropriate in our services, but they wouldn't be appropriate for them. And one of the things I asked her when I talked to her again, I said, I've been thinking about the service itself, and how do you feel about, a lot of our chants are in Japanese, I said I could do a short one so that you could get the flavor of it, but you wouldn't have to chant like a whole long thing in Japanese, which I'm pretty sure you guys wouldn't feel comfortable with. And she said, yeah, I want something like that, but she said, you're right, short is better. So we picked the Enmeijuku Kanangyo for that one, because it's short, and you repeat it 3 times, so you get a chance to learn it as you go. And it's one of those ones, every syllable is the same emphasis all the way through. I mean, it's so consistent that I hope it will be easy for them. And in the middle of this, because even the second call that was the day that she called me. And that was the day that the police released the bodies. To add insult to injury, you go to pick up your dead child, and you find out you have to pay for the privilege. And so her first question to me was, how much do you charge? I said, I don't charge anything. And she said, well, I want to do the right thing. And I said, I don't charge. I said, you don't need to pay. And she was like, well, okay, if you're sure. And I said, yeah, I'm sure, But she did find out later that in some traditions, there are gifts offered. So we will be receiving some gifts to bring back here, mostly cloths, tapestry, something like that. But and I wasn't going to refuse that because it was important to her to offer that. But it wasn't important that it be money. Have any of you seen the film The Way with Martin Sheen? His son is he goes on the Camino de Santiago, and he dies in an accident the first day. And there's a scene toward the beginning of the film, Martin Sheen goes to France to pick up his body. And he has to identify him. It's just pretty hard. And it ends up being a life-changing experience for him. But the bleakness of physically being with your dead child is, well, for me, because I have no children, a little bit unimaginable, and yet I could imagine it because Martin Sheen's a great actor, and he was able to express it in a way that was heart-wrenching, but restrained. So, I mean, maybe it sounds weird, but my life is full of pop references because I grew up in the 60s when television was like king in every household. So a lot of the things that I identify in many ways in my life are films, television, music. There's always a reference. There's always a song in my head, too. Although I think I'm luckier than one of the priests I knew who said he spent one entire sesshin with ABBA's Dancing Queen in his head. He said, I thought I was going to go crazy. Actually, some of you may know him, Kosho.
Oh, yeah.
So, anyway. So yeah, the film actually kind of helped me in that moment to grasp a little bit of how hard that was for her to do that, and how hard it was for her to ask me that question, because she didn't want me not to be able to do the service, but she wanted to be sure she could afford it, because clearly this was an expense she hadn't planned on. So a little bit after that, I was doing something very different, but it was related in an odd way. I went to Creighton Prep and met with a high school class of boys.
Catholic boys.
Yes, Catholic boys. And I went to a Jesuit university. I grew up Catholic, so, familiar territory, but I didn't go to an all-girls school. I did go to a university, Jesuit university, that had just become co-ed from being all boys. So you got a sense of what that was like. And they were, in some ways they were typical boys of that age. I grew up with a younger brother, so his friends were around a lot. It's not unfamiliar to me, although my brother is now, in his 60s, so not quite the same guy that I knew when he was a teenager. But then I'm not the same either. Anyway, they had a teacher who had been teaching them Buddhism. They were still early in the term, I guess, but they'd already learned a fair bit. So I went in knowing that. And, there were questions that they had, and there were things that, I wanted to be able to share with them. But one of the questions was really kind of fascinating. The one young man, there were only a few questions, of course. I mean, when you're in high school and somebody comes in from outside, quite often no questions happen. They were a little prepared to ask some questions, but they were not quite as comfortable as, they might have been. Anyway, this one young man said, well, can you talk about the spiritual side? I was like, wow, okay. And I said, well, that's why we're going to sit today, because the spiritual side is really very much about the meditation. I mean, there are also other things you can talk about, but I said the meditation is the foundation of what the Buddha taught. And we came back to that a couple times during the class, but it was a really interesting experience because I was trying something completely different. I mean, I haven't done a ton of these, but I did do one with a group of girls who came in from Mercy High School, and Pam and I did that together, and Ileana was there, and the girls were much more forthcoming in their expression of, what they thought, questions they had, but they were also here on different territory, so it was a different experience for them. These guys were in their classroom, which was at my request. I wanted them on their home turf, where they were comfortable, and I started out with a Hershey's Kiss. Everybody got one as a mindfulness form of meditation, and they all participated. Nobody turned it away. But they didn't have a lot to say. And I made it clear that they didn't have to speak. I was going to invite them to ask questions and invite them to share their experience, but they did not have to. There was no pressure. There was no specific outcome I was looking for. they seemed fine with that. A little puzzled maybe, but I was also trying to take the pressure off their teacher, because I know teachers feel like the kids have to make them look good. And I wanted them to realize you don't have to make them look good. They're great anyway. Anyway, we went through a number of different ways to sit, a number of different periods of sitting. And by the end of the class, there were people who did speak, who asked questions, who did make comments, but not very many. And I kept letting them know. I said, don't worry about it. I said, I'm going to keep saying it, and I said, and I know it feels awkward when I just let there be silence. And you're all thinking, I should be saying something. I should be asking a question. You don't have to. I said, it's okay to let it be awkward. We're here together. That you're participating. That's all that matters. You don't participate in a certain way. You participate in your way. And if you don't feel comfortable asking the questions or saying what you think, that is fine. Because that comes with time with something that's strange to you. And then we did do writing practice, a very, very brief one, like 2 minutes, where I gave them a prompt, the I remember prompt, and they wrote for 2 minutes. And everybody did it. And I think the teacher and I were the only ones, one other person read ours, and no one else wanted to read. And again, that was fine. And it was understandable, because that's asking them to be really vulnerable, and I could see they didn't want to do that. And then I said, okay, so you've done all these different ways to meditate. I said, now I want you to feel free to get up out of your chair and go sit wherever you want. You can sit on the floor if you want to try cross-legged. You can lay down on the floor if you want to. You can lean against the wall. You can do whatever you want to. You can move your chair somewhere else because you like the other space better. Just whatever feels comfortable to you, do that now, and then we'll sit. And there was a moment where nobody moved, and they all kind of looked at each other and looked at their teacher, and then they moved. And yes, there were 2 people who laid down on the floor, and yes, we had some gentle snoring during that period of zazen, which was, we all chuckled. I mean, there was nothing wrong with that. I've fallen asleep during zazen myself on occasion. But what was interesting was after that, we did a circle. I asked them, I said, could you just, as much as you can, I said, the tables are going to be in the way, that's fine. Don't push them out of the way. Just make a rough circle around the room. And we faced each other. And then I said, I am going to invite you to speak again, but not yet. I said, first we're just going to sit for a minute. I said, and in case you haven't noticed, I don't look at the clock. I said, not to be too California, but I feel the energy of the room. I can feel when you're settled. And that's what I'm looking for, is to get everybody settled and then sit for a few minutes. So I said, so at some point, when I feel like we're settled and we've sat a little bit, I'm going to start so nobody else has to. And I'm going to share my experience of what this day has been, because it was almost time to go. I said, now we're going to go around, and I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to start here, and we're going to go around this direction. And you are free to pass. You do not have to speak. If you would like to speak, you can. And it doesn't have to be anything long. You can just say, I really like this, I really hated that. And I said, and you're allowed to say you hated something or you thought the whole thing was really stupid. I said, my ego is not involved in this. This is about you being able to say what you felt about the day. And I had no idea. I mean, I kind of figured like half of them would pass. In the end, though, only 2 people passed. And And I found myself saying something I didn't expect to say. Because when we sat there and I felt their willingness to participate in every single thing I asked of them, even if they didn't say much, they did it. And they did it completely. And so when I had a chance to speak, I thanked them for that. And I said, this is actually quite uncomfortable for me because I'm an introvert. And standing here and being silent and inviting you to speak and having you not speak, that's really uncomfortable. But I also know it's okay because I'm one of the people who probably wouldn't have spoken either. And I understand that. And my practice is to not care about the outcome. But the reality is, for someone who's an introvert, standing up here, being the center of attention, and having nobody say anything is really awkward. I said, but awkward is fine. And you guys have been amazing because you have participated. And I also then thanked them for being really good teachers because I did learn a lot. And what I learned was something that I immediately applied to the situation with the memorial service, which is not to worry about the outcome. You do what you can do. You offer what you have to offer. And it's going to be imperfect. And it's not going to make it any better. But offering presence is a form of compassion. It is compassion. And a friend of mine wrote an essay on Substack. And it was interesting because I found myself comparing sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And it's actually kind of almost a process of getting deeper and deeper into being willing to give. Sympathy that's the immediate thing when somebody's distressed or crying, you feel for them. You may or may not say anything to them, depends maybe on how close you are. And even if you do, it's still, sympathy it leads often to pity. And that's there's that person, here I am. Not deep connection with sympathy and pity. Empathy is different. There's connection there. There's someone in the comments wrote it was like a contagion. I thought, well, that doesn't sound too good. But what they meant was that if you are someone who can be empathetic to other people, you're drawn to them because you do understand what they're going through, and there is a connection that is there that often you don't even have to speak about it. You just understand that somehow you are connected through this event. And compassion takes it a step further. You want to do something to help. You want to do something to ease their suffering. Now, the other thing that's interesting is sympathy and compassion are both primarily dealing with suffering and distress. But empathy can be joyful as well. It can be positive or negative emotions. The other two are mostly sadness, suffering. But I would also say there is a thing called sympathetic joy, so I'm going to leave that one wide open. I don't need to define them that carefully. But again, I come back to what to do today, because the service is today. It's right after this. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. I I don't even have an idea of how I want it to turn out because I don't have a plan for that. I just want them to feel that they are able to connect with this young man and his wife and their unborn child. And part of the practice of doing that in the memorial service is, I've been to some where, a lot of them, where people are given Buddhist names if they don't have them already. And so I talked with Daishin about that, and I did that for all three of them, and then made cards with the kanji and the name, and then the translation of the name, and then their real name, their given name. So it's a way to give the family. I realized when you're doing something like that, when you're putting this kind of memorial service together, it actually, I mean, for them, it's for him, because he was the one who became a Buddhist and wanted this kind of thing, even though obviously they didn't have a chance to ask him, but it's really for them that I'm doing this. I will never get a chance to know him except through his family. And I'll probably hear a lot about him today, because in a Buddhist ceremony, often you invite the family and friends to share their memories of the person rather than have a eulogy. Some have both, but in this case, we're going to allow everyone to speak for themselves. So we'll learn a lot about who these three people were. Well, the unborn child, I mean, it's who she might have been. And I there's a lot that has happened through this process for me. Because I've never tried to do anything quite like this, with this level of responsibility, but also the complications for the family, and thinking, you know, am I even going to be able to do this without them getting upset? You know, without, I mean, are they going to even feel taken care of in this? And I don't know. They might not. They might be disappointed. They might be, I mean, some of them still might be looking for the lightning to come through the windows. I hope not, but the reality is that we face stuff like this every day in much smaller ways, where we rarely know what to do to really be present for other people. All we can do is our best. All we can do is offer who we are, what we are. And in the end, that has to be enough, because that's what we have. I'm trying to think, there was a phrase somebody used. What you can do is all you can do, and all you can do is enough. And when I first heard that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's one of those, you know, self-help phrases that's supposed to make you feel better. But then I started to pick it apart, and I thought, no, there's actually something to that. You know, we create expectations of ourselves. But I learned a long time ago, with anything like a memorial service or a funeral, or even walking into that classroom, it's not about me. It's about them. It's about those boys and their lived experience of Buddhism, so that the words that their teacher is teaching them come alive, and they understand what the Buddha was doing and why, and what it feels like. Because the one thing those kids said, more than, I think half of them said this, when we went around in the circle, the one thing that they really liked was it was peaceful. And a couple of them elaborated. They said this was a really crazy week because they were trying out for sports and teams and, you know, all kinds of other activities. And they said just the quiet was really nice. They said it's not usually quiet in here or anywhere. I think they meant in the whole school, but, you know, I wasn't going to ask for clarification. So that was, it made me think, yeah, I didn't do this for me. You know, I did it because they invited me to give them a view of Buddhism that their teacher couldn't, which is the lived view, the experiential view. And did I do it perfectly? Of course not. I mean, I'm sure somebody else could have done it better. But that's not really the point. I was the one who was there. And today I'll be the one officiating. And will I do the best job of anybody? Of course not. And I'll make mistakes. I mean, this is going to be the most interesting service. I mean, I told George this morning, I said, you realize, you know, they were going to have it outside. Well, fortunately, they did move it inside with the impending storm, but we're now having it at a bar. And ironically, it's called the American Dream Bar, which I thought was pretty hilarious. And I thought it was interesting with the snow too, because we have a little family legend. When my mother died, the day before the first viewing, when my sister was supposed to drive to Pittsburgh with her family, it snowed, and they had to wait till the next day. And she called me and she said, "Do you believe the snow?" I said, "Well, it does make me think Mom's paying attention." Because when we were in high school, anytime my sister wanted, we were close in age, so we would do stuff together. Anytime my sister wanted to borrow the car to do something with our youth group, it snowed. I mean, it seemed like every time. That's actually not true, but it felt like it. And my mother would not let us, depending on how bad the snow was, she would say, "No, you can't have the car." Because my sister did once kind of ding the suspension when the snow was slippery and she banged into the curb. So, and my sister would accuse her of making it snow. It was an ongoing joke in the family after that, but those are the things that in this couple of weeks have made me laugh, because we have to have humor too. You know, you have to do the best that you can, and you have to keep going. You have to live your life. You still have to feed the cat when it comes to the door, you know. Life keeps going on. And it will for this family too. And today will help them move on simply because they're having the service. However they feel about it, it'll be a moment where they've taken the time to honor these people that they love, and somehow doing that enables us to move on at least a little bit. Not easily and not completely. It takes time for those things. And all I'm doing is facilitating. I mean, I am putting a lot of my own feeling into it, yes. But like I said, it's not about me. It's about them. And it's about what they need. And what they need more than anything else is my presence, George's presence as Doan, Rabbi Stephen's presence, people who weren't part of their family coming here and saying this is important, and we recognize that. I mean, we're witness and presence, and if that's the minimum we can do, that's okay too. You know, you don't always know how it ends. You don't always know how people feel. And you don't always know how the members of that family will all take it. I'm reliably informed by the mother that there is one, I think he was an uncle, who will seek out the rabbi and me as the clergy people and tell us inappropriate jokes. She wanted me to be forewarned. I don't know, George, you look pretty official too. You might get a few of his jokes.
I have inappropriate jokes I can share back with you.
Excellent. You can do my share.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to share a quote from the essay that my friend wrote, because for me this is one of the things you may or may not know about me. I mean, I'm here until mid-May when Shinkyu comes back and I've handed over to him. And I'm kind of on a pilgrimage that doesn't really have a destination. And I have a lot of questions about how to be in this world as a priest. And I've talked about them in my Way Seeking Mind talk and in the talk after that. And then I read this last line in the essay. It was about emotional intelligence and how exhausting that can be. And one of the ending lines was, she's talking about the tiredness of someone who sees accurately what is there, who has spent years trying to figure out what that seeing obliges them to do, and who has arrived not at an answer, but at something harder and more durable, the ability to continue asking. And I felt like that was a real it was an expression of where I am right now. Is I'm still asking questions, and I don't think I'll ever really stop asking questions. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not having answers. I'm okay with trying to work through to find the answer in this moment. And I kind of feel like that is what I can do. That's pretty much all I can do. And wouldn't have been okay 10 years ago. But today, now, that makes sense for me. So I will stop there and say thank you.
Thank you.
And